Hey everybody, welcome back. This is the third lecture video for week 11. We have already talked about the life of Muhammad, what happened after his death. In the second lecture video, we talked about how Islam impacts really the eastern portion of the Roman Empire in Syria and Palestine and in Egypt. And now we are continuing looking at how the Muslim conquest progresses by looking at a couple of regions that at least partially fall in the Eastern and the Western Roman Empire, but especially with the second location definitely fits within the Western Roman Empire. And so that's sort of how we're going to break this lecture video down. First of all, talk about Islam's presence and conquest through North Africa, and then talk about how from there how Islam is introduced into Spain and exists for a pretty long period of time. And then we'll conclude at the end by looking at a few really concluding thoughts or remarks about the overall legacy of the Muslim conquest and what that does for the history, what that shows about Christianity, but also what it shows about the history of Christianity moving forward. Well, that being said, let's go ahead and look at the presence of Islam in North Africa. So one thing that you want to keep in mind with this is sort of similar to some other areas where Islam had already been introduced, right? Arabia, Syria, Palestine, and in part a little bit of an influence in Egypt as well. And that's the fact that there were a lot of divisions among Christians. And this was particularly true with North Africa. And in some ways it affects the history of Christianity in this region a little bit differently than it does particularly in, say, Egypt. So if we recall some things that we've already talked about, we've already mentioned about the Donatist schism, right? And again, that was concerning what do you do about those Christians that had lapsed during persecution, but now they wanted to essentially be restored to the church and put in good standing. What do you do about those individuals? And you recall that people were divided over that matter. There were some that didn't have a problem letting them back in. There were others, particularly the Donatists, that were a lot more stringent on that. They didn't have such easy regulations for people to enter in. Sometimes some of the Donatists, again, didn't even want those that had lapsed during persecution to ever be readmitted back to the church. And again, we keep in mind that we talked about how that divide had shaped North Africa and how in the urban areas, especially in the city of Carthage, how the Donatists were generally not as well accepted. And generally that was sort of the stronger source of really the Catholic Church. Whereas some of the rural areas, the areas particularly west of Carthage were more supportive of the Donatists. And so you sort of had that religious division, you had that regional division. And so really in all, the Donatist schism sowed controversy among Christians. It rather sowed division among the Christians in that area. Another thing that you want to keep in mind too concerns the Vandal invasions. Again, the Vandals were a Germanic group that had come down, and during the 5th and 6th centuries they had settled in parts of North Africa. And what they did is that they introduced Arianism to that area. And again, Arianism was the idea that Jesus Christ was not actually the Son of God. He was a lesser form of God. And when the Vandals invaded that area, they went about setting up what might be thought of as an Arian Christian kingdom in the region. And what happens as a result is now the two groups that had been there, right, the Catholics and the Donatists, both of them had essentially been punished under an Arian kingdom because that was part of how they were going to promote Arianism in the region is putting down the Catholics and the Donatists. So you see a process of clergy being exiled in the area. The Arian Christians prevented the Catholics and Donatists from appointing their bishops, really as a way to keep both of those churches from functioning. There was a there was a really important writer. His name was Fulgentius, and I'm not going to ask you this on a quiz or exam, but he was a very important writer at the time. He was a very effective debater at the time, but even he was banished by the Arian Christians on multiple occasions. So you've got a lot of turmoil going on amongst Christians in North Africa, and that's going to prove to be a lasting difference between Egypt, because we talked about how the Coptic Church, which exists today and has been in the news on several occasions, you can sort of trace that pretty well back. According to the Coptic Church, you could trace it all the way back to John Mark, but in reality too, you can trace Coptic Christianity well past the Muslim conquests that are happening at this time. That's not necessarily going to be true for the history of Christianity in North Africa, as we'll see here in a moment. But that's important to keep in mind. And just as a thought, I want to pull up the map real quick to sort of illustrate again where some of these areas are. So again, the controversy between the Donatists, just as a reminder, you had Carthage here. That's the center of Catholic Christianity. The Donatists had generally been pretty popular in the areas west of Carthage. The Vandals had obviously settled this portion of northern Africa. And that's, again, this is just a reminder maybe to get your mind wrapped around what area we're talking about. And as you can see, this map's already got the Arab forces, or the Muslim forces have already invaded the area according to this map. So we go back to our PowerPoint. We've got that in mind. When it came to the conquest of North Africa, it does take a little bit more time than it did in Egypt and Syria. And again, that's just because of the fact that you go back and you look at the map, the coastline of North Africa is much longer, right, than the territory of Egypt. So you've got that basic fact that North Africa spread out a lot more. The invasions of North Africa began in the 640s AD, and really the final major battle was when the Muslim forces were able to take the city of Carthage in 698 AD, which is the major city on the coast of North Africa at the time. And so when you think about life under Muslim rule, there are going to be some similarities. One difference that's noteworthy, at least, is that in North Africa, when the Muslim forces came, many of the Christians fled the area. Some fled to Italy, some fled to Spain. The islands there on the Mediterranean, like Sicily and places like that, those places were sources where Christians fled to, that are leaving the area where they don't want to live a life under Muslim rule. And so what happens as a result is that, one, in North Africa, a lot of obviously the population of Christians dwindled because of that, right? There are a lot of local places where the presence of churches, the presence of Christians declined because of the people that were fleeing from that area, which is a little bit different than Egypt and Syria and Palestine, where you didn't see a mass exodus of Christians from that area at that point. And one thing about the Christians fleeing is that you don't have a lot of written evidence. You don't have nearly as many written sources from Christians living in this area at the time, or at least shortly thereafter this time. And it's often been thought of that this was part of the evidence that showed that Christianity suffered a steeper decline in this area than it did in Syria and Palestine because of the number of Christians that fled. But there would still be a presence. The Pope would sometimes refer to there is correspondence from the Pope to what was called the Church of Africa, which was a reference to North Africa. But the point being is that a lot of Christians fled. So in part, it does weaken Christianity in this area a little bit, maybe a little bit more differently than it did in Egypt and Syria and Palestine, where you didn't have as many Christians that fled the area. Now, when it came to the rule, Muslim rule over the people, over Christians in that area, there were some similarities. One, of course, was the fact that Christians and Jews, at least early on, were considered a protected people. as we talked about before, right? As long as they supported the Muslim government and they paid their taxes, they could pretty much observe their religion, right? And so you have that to think about. But you do see, again, a subtle erosion of Christianity. Obviously, the enforcement of the Arabic language and things of that nature. You also see, again, how the Muslim government uses coins as a subtle way to subtly attack Christianity. And on those coins that archaeologists have found in North Africa, there's some that are written in Latin, and one of the phrases that was written on some of the coins was a phrase that's similar to what we've already heard. The phrase was, "There is no God but the one God, and he has no associate like him." So, again, like we noted with the earlier phrase about God not having any one that was begotten, the first phrase, again, shows obviously the belief in Allah. There is no God but the one God. But then that second phrase, that he has no associate like him, that was an indirect reference to Jesus, right? And that was to sort of deny the deity of Jesus in that regard. So that was one way in which Christianity was subtly being eroded. And in all, by the 12th century, there's a very small presence of Christianity. And there are some exceptions to that, but the way that you could trace, say, the Coptic Church all the way to the time, even the time before the Muslim conquest, you don't have that. You don't necessarily have that same ability to trace the history of Christianity in North Africa all the way back to the time period before the conquest of Islam. There's not that direct line that goes all the way back, so to speak, like you have that direct line that goes all the way back through the Coptic Church. You don't have that in North Africa. So that's something that's a little bit different than what we've talked about before that I think is important to point out. So now let's shift gears and talk about Spain. And what I want to do first is talk about the history of Christianity in Spain. We recall, if we have read the book of Romans 15 verse 28, that one of the potential destination spots for the Apostle Paul was Spain. And he, again, wrote that while more than likely he's in prison in Rome. There are some people that have suggested that Paul went on a fourth missionary journey to Spain. And there's no biblical evidence for this. But we do know that Christianity arrived in Spain early on. Maybe Paul did go to Spain, but we don't necessarily have any biblical evidence outside of Paul wanting to go to Spain. So the presence of Christianity was there pretty early on. One thing that was thought of with Spain, at least for a lot of people at that time, was that Spain was sort of seen as the end of the world. Sort of the farthest reaches of the world at the time, at least to the west. Certainly because of the Atlantic Ocean. We know today that that's not true, but back then, a lot of people's understanding was that Spain was the sort of the end of the world, the farthest point west. When you think about the early history of Christianity in Spain, by the 3rd century, there was already pretty much an extensive church structure that was similar to the church structure that was found throughout Europe and through the Western Roman Empire and through the Eastern Roman Empire in terms of bishops and that system that had developed. One thing that's interesting to note is that at first the churches in Spain, they didn't look to Rome as the supreme authority. They actually looked to the church in Carthage as the supreme authority. And this can be seen by some letters that were written not to the Bishop of Rome, but actually to the Bishop of Carthage in terms of answers to doctrinal questions. But later on that changes. One of the things about this region too is that it was known for producing both secular and religious intellectuals. And that was sort of its legacy, sort of what it was known for. And even that would continue. That intellectual tradition would even continue during the while Muslim rule was in Spain. Right, so Christianity arrives fairly early on. By the 5th and 6th centuries, though, you have the Visigoths, who again had been part of the invading force of Italy. We talked about that as one of the major sources as which led up to the sort of the downfall of the Western Roman Empire. Well, they had left Italy, they moved farther west, and they did settle in Spain. And so when they come to the area, they bring with them Arianism. And again, we've talked about what that is before. And sort of like in North Africa, the Visigoths want to sort of establish Arianism as the official language of the area. But there is a moment where an Arian king actually, a Visigoth king, who supports Arianism, he converts to Catholicism, and that sort of becomes the new official religion in the area. And you again see the flourishing of the intellectual tradition that a lot of religious scholars would come out of this area at the time. Now, one thing that is noteworthy too is that in Spain, generally the Jews fared pretty poorly under Christian rule. They were prevented from building synagogues. They were restricted in a lot of ways. They could not hold public office. There were sometimes decrees, although it's questioned how much they were enforced, but there were some official decrees that were passed that forbid circumcision, that forbid the celebration of the Passover, that enforced baptism. And so what that results in is that when the Muslim forces come into Spain, the Jews in that area looked at this maybe as a moment of liberation in a way because of how they were being treated under Christian rule in that area at the time. So we think about the conquest of Spain. I'll pull up a map here, but when it came to how that happened, again, the natural thought here is again that they've conquered the coast of North Africa and then they simply just moved up into Spain. Right, so off the coast of North Africa, that's how they invaded Spain. Again, just a natural geographic fact to point out there. So so by the early 8th century, the Muslim forces are going to pretty much control all of Spain, right? And so now you think about, really within 100 years, Islam has spread from primarily a few cities in Arabia all the way to Syria, Palestine, all along the coast of the northern portion of Africa, and now into Spain. All that happens within 100 years, which is very rapid. The Visigothic king that had been had ruled in the area, he dies in battle. It opens the door for more victories for the Muslim forces. But one important event that happens, because it seems like there's nothing that's going to stop the spread of Islam even into northern Europe. So one important event that's often been noted in the study of history is what was the Battle of Tours. And this is where Muslim forces were essentially looking to invade France and to spread Islam there. So you go back and you look at your map. I'll pull up another one, and this is something interesting to point out here. You go back, think about it. You're right here at 600 AD, no presence of Islam at all, and then by 700 AD, Islam spread throughout, obviously into Persia, but again all along the coast of North Africa. By 800 AD, Islam is pretty much in control of most of Spain. Well, after they had conquered Spain, they looked to invade France again from the south. And what happens is that you see the grandfather of Charlemagne, whose name was Charles, would lead an army of the Franks to meet the Muslim forces. And Charlemagne's grandfather was successful in doing that. He defeats the Muslims in a lot of ways, prevents them from coming into northern Europe, which is one of the more important moments, because some have said that, if they're not victorious there, very well could be that France today is a Muslim country. At least through its history, France has always been associated with Catholic Christianity, with Catholicism, right? And so some people look at this battle as sort of being very momentous in terms of the preservation of Christianity throughout Europe. So that's important to keep in mind, the Battle of Tours, which again just simply resulted in Islam not spreading throughout northern Europe. So let's talk about Muslim rule in Spain. So I've mentioned this before, but you had the Umayyad Caliphate, and you maybe pronounce it in a few different ways. That caliphate, which is really the kingdom that is driving the Muslim forces, their expansion, their capital's in Damascus. Well, that kingdom is overthrown by another group of Muslim leaders. Well, the grandson of the caliph, the king, actually leaves the area and he escapes to Spain. He gathers an army and is able to take control of Spain, which leads to the beginning of the Kingdom of Cordoba. And this was said at the time to be one of the nicest cities in the world in terms of all the amenities that it had. The city itself became known for a center of learning. The Arabic language is important. The only way that you could get into public service in terms of, holding public office was you had to learn Arabic. And there were a lot of Christians that, in the process of learning Arabic, that actually converted to Islam in the area just to hold public office. So that's important to keep in mind, but there were restrictions placed on Christianity. One restriction was that they could not build new church buildings. Some of the church buildings were translated into a mosque, but there was a policy where they couldn't build new church buildings. There were policies also that prevented the public displays of Christianity, specifically on feast days and things of that nature. Another thing too that is a little bit different than maybe what we talked about is that any time that a Christian woman married to a Muslim man, it meant that the whole family had to convert to Islam. So, if you married, we think about today, generally some people, maybe they have different religious views, they marry, but they don't have to sacrifice it. Well, at the time, if you were a Christian woman and you married a Muslim man, the policies of the government of the Kingdom of Cordoba was that you had to, if you're a Christian woman, you would have to take on the views of your Muslim husband. So you would have to convert to Islam, and your entire family as well. And so that was, in a way, a restriction that was placed on Christianity, right? It would certainly weaken the presence and growth of Christians in that area. Well, there was an event where some Christians grew tired of Muslim rule in Spain. And there are several events, but we're just going to look at this one in particular. But there was an event, a series of events that sort of collectively have been called the Martyrs of Cordoba. And this all began in 851 AD. It began when a monk named Isaac sort of began a series of protests. Really protests the rule, but he leads and sort of influences a series of protests. So Isaac, who had been a government official working under the Muslim government in the area, the Kingdom of Cordoba, he becomes a monk. He goes to a monastery outside of the city. He comes back to Cordoba, and at first he wants to sort of be instructed on the teachings of Islam by a particular government official. But turns out that's not really wanted at all. And what he did was he sort of verbally insulted Muhammad. And the government officials got mad, and so they had him killed. They had him beheaded. They take his body and they hang it up in the city for all the public to see. There are some Christians that actually disagreed with what Isaac had done. there were some Christians that disagreed with what Isaac had done. He was charged with blasphemy when he had done this. But the reason why some Christians disagree with what Isaac did, you have to keep in mind the ideas of martyrdom that we talked about before. You might recall that we talked about how some saw martyrdom as something you did not volunteer for yourself, but God sort of chose it for you. And the Bishop of Seville sort of condemned what Isaac had done because Isaac sort of had volunteered himself to be a martyr rather than allowing outside forces that sort of forced him in that direction. It was almost like he chose martyrdom. There are still some Christians that look down on choosing yourself and submitting yourself to be a martyr. But there are other Christians that actually agreed with what Isaac had done. And there's a series of events, there are a series of examples that follow Isaac in the same way, where there's a public denunciation of Muhammad that leads to the death of individuals. And it's recorded that they commit blasphemy, or they've insulted the name of Muhammad. The last occasion of this occurs in 931 AD. So for 80 years you had a movement where occasionally people came forward and they spoke publicly against Muhammad, and that led to their death. It wouldn't be until a few centuries later, about the 1400s, when Islam would be completely driven out of Spain. And this is called the Reconquista, if you do any more research on it. And the Reconquista actually, it covers about 700 years. It really covers even when Islam is first introduced into Spain, the resistance then, all the way up for 700 years when Islam is, at least in a governing fashion, the Muslim government is sort of driven out of Spain altogether. But that's something to keep in mind. That's the extent in which Islam has grown and spread throughout Europe. So if we go back and we look at our map again, we keep in mind that whereas Islam only started in a few cities, really 150 years later it had already spread all the way onto the borders of France. That's how quickly it had grown. And so now when we think about the final takeaways or the final concluding thoughts concerning Islam, we do want to note, of course, that Islam spread quickly, partially because of the division of Christians. You had the differing doctrines between the Orthodox Church and the Monophysites that had taken place in Syria and Egypt, and while they weren't on the same page as Constantinople, for a lot of those that had disagreed with Constantinople, who had been alienated by the fact that they did not agree with the Orthodox Church, it seemed at first that these Muslim forces, the spread of Islam, it seemed at first like a better alternative because they promised to allow them to practice their religion without any restrictions. And for a time, it seemed like maybe those in Syria and Palestine had done the right thing. They were able to practice Christianity without any major restrictions, but later on, as we talked about, sometimes those restrictions tightened in terms of the push for the people to learn Arabic and certain restrictions against the presence of Christianity, as we've talked about in the last two lecture videos. So within that, a lot of the older centers of Christianity at this point had fallen, right? The strongholds of Alexandria and Antioch and Jerusalem, places that within the first few centuries of the church were looked at as sort of major centers of Christianity, all that begins to go away as a result of the spread of Islam throughout that area. And so now the center and the importance of Christianity, at least at this time, begins to shift more and more towards Europe. And that's important because we think about how that has influenced us today, right? Even though Christianity began in the Middle East, the presence of Christians today is not as great as in areas where Europeans settled, right? And we know that for most of us, our ancestors probably came from Europe, which helps explain why you see a large presence of Christians in the United States, because a lot of the shift, the center of Christianity shift to Europe. And that has, that even though that had an impact then, it has an impact today in terms of how Christianity is spread to not just places in Europe, but where other Europeans settled, right? And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. It made so much sense at the time why the Pope decided to crown Charlemagne as Emperor of the West, sort of the emperor of a new Christian kingdom, the Holy Roman Empire, because now the presence of the church in Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria wasn't so great anymore, because the center of Christianity had shifted. Again, within those divisions, we keep in mind the Donatists and the Catholics and the introduction of Arianism. It hurt the presence of Christianity in North Africa, right? And so you don't have that same long-standing tradition that you can trace back to, trace all the way back to this time, like you do in Egypt, where you can trace the Coptic Church today all the way back to even before the Muslim conquest in Egypt. And then number two, what ties in really with week 12 is the fact that the spread of Islam hastens the militarization of Christianity. Certainly you see Christianity and kingdoms promoting Christianity in battle beforehand, right? We talked about the Germanic tribes. Charlemagne had expanded his kingdom throughout parts of Europe where they had not accepted Christianity, and you see those people convert to Christianity. But now this is a different thing, because the Muslim forces, the Muslim Caliphate, the kingdom that has been established over the past 150 years at this point, there's no willingness necessarily to convert to Christianity at all. And so part of that result and part of the fear of Islam continuing to spread was the need to combat it through using force. And we'll talk about that more in week 12 when we talk about the Crusades. Well, that being said, we'll go ahead and stop here, but thank you for your time and your attention. And again, like I said, we will pick up with the Crusades in week 12.